We'll now introduce our first witness, the Honorable Jim DeMint, former senator from South Carolina, chairman of the Conservative Partnership Institute, and a longtime friend to many of us on this committee. Senator DeMint served the American people in both houses of Congress. From 1999 to 2005, he represented South Carolina's 4th District, and from 2007 to 2013, he represented the state of South Carolina in the United States Senate, where he authored leading conservative reforms to health care, to education, taxes, and entitlements. Among his many achievements, Senator DeMint led conservative efforts to ban congressional earmarks, something that the Republican conference this year made a permanent ban within our conference. Most relevant to today's hearing, Senator DeMint led an effort to impose term limits on members of the House and Senate, ultimately taking a resolution that would have expressed the sense of the Senate that the Constitution ought to be amended to include term limits to the floor of the Senate. At the conclusion of his service in the Senate, Senator DeMint became the president of the Heritage Foundation, working there for 4 years. Senator DeMint is currently the chairman of the Conservative Policy Institute, and he is also the founder of the Senate Conservatives Fund. Senator DeMint is the author of several books, including Now or Never, Saving America from Economic Collapse, The Great American Awakening, 2 Years That Changed America, Saving Freedom, We Can Stop America's Slide into Socialism, and most recently, Falling in Love with America Again, which debuted at number 1 on the Washington Post bestseller list. Senator DeMint, welcome, and I would ask that you stand and be sworn in. You'd raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you're about to give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ranking member, former colleagues on the subcommittee. It's extremely gracious of you to invite me today, especially considering I'm going to spend my time advocating for your unemployment. It's nothing personal, I promise. I get the opportunity to travel all over the country and speak to a lot of groups, and I find there are many issues where the opinions of the American people in Congress are divergent. But there are few issues where that gap is as large as the issue of term limits. If you need a standing applause line, it's talk about term limits, and people will stand up and applaud. As Mr. Chairman, you've already pointed out, somewhere between 75–80% of Americans believe in term limits, not only for congressmen and senators, but they sure like the idea of judges and bureaucrats because they instinctively know what is an eternal truth, that power corrupts. And in Washington, seniority is closely associated with power. There are good arguments for and against congressional term limits, and these are roughly the same arguments that delegates debated at the Constitutional Convention. It was George Mason of Virginia who argued that nothing is so essential to the preservation of a Republican government as a periodic rotation of its representatives. For his part, Rufus King of New York insisted that he who has proved himself to be most fit for an office ought not to be excluded by the Constitution from holding it. In theory, both are right. A governmental turnover is undeniably healthy for any republic, especially for one as large and diverse as we are. Meanwhile, disqualifying unusually capable legislators from serving would be a definite loss to our country. The philosophical argument about term limits can be a close call, as it was in 1787. Unlike our founders, however, we don't have to confine our debate to theoretical abstractions. We can draw on real-world experience with our 230-year-old system, and especially its performance over the last few decades. And the practical case for term limits, Mr. Chairman, is no longer a close call. We do not have to speculate, as the founders did, that the prospect of a permanent tenure in Congress might tempt senators and representatives towards self-interested, short-term thinking. We know for a fact, especially in recent decades when control of Congress has been constantly up for grabs, This short-term thinking has become Congress's defining defect. For individual members, short-term thinking warps incentives towards bringing home the bacon and fundraising, and to the special interest who can deliver them both. Members spend less time legislating and more time raising money, both for their own re-elections and for the political action committees specifically designed to finance their careerist ambitions. And members quickly give up their campaign promises of bold ideas such as balancing the budget and turn to new programs spending more money that they can deliver to their constituents. As individual members have retreated from their legislative responsibilities, party leaders have, however poorly, filled the gap. Given their incentives, leaders now use the House and Senate not as legislative institutions, but as arms of their party's campaign committees. The Senate, in particular, no longer functions as a legislative body at all. Leaders of both parties have shut down deliberative floor debate and amendment votes for the sole purpose of shielding senators from politically controversial votes, thereby denying the American people's right to an accountable legislature. Members who criticize this dysfunctional shirts versus skins approach are chastised for not being team players and threatened with being cut off from their party leader's special interest fundraising gravy train. Conscious, burdened senators and representatives are reassured that this process, however imperfect, is simply how they make their way in Washington. But in truth, it's how Washington makes its way into them. Lifelong tenure incentivizes members to prioritize the next election over the next generation and partisanship over statesmanship. It realigns their interest away from the American people and towards the swamp. The consequences are all around us. The $22 trillion national debt, the wasteful pork barrel programs appropriated specifically to facilitate members' reelection, the unreformed entitlement programs that both parties know are hurling the nation into insolvency, Congress's lack of oversight over the sprawling federal bureaucracy, the power of special interest, particularly the corrupt allure of a lucrative post-congressional career on K Street for members who play ball, the total disappearance of the budget process, the breakdown of the legislative process, especially in the Senate, the mindless partisanship, the collapse of public confidence in Congress as an institution. Now, I know term limits would not solve all of these problems, but they would significantly change incentives throughout the political system. In Washington, fundraising would become less important, and so special interests would be less powerful, and partisanship less personally or politically rewarding. Term limits might open up space and maybe even provide a little courage towards action on politically difficult issues like entitlement reform, health care, immigration, and budget reform. By closing off avenues to be something important, term limits might reintroduce senators and representatives to the appeal of doing something important for their constituents, for their country, and for themselves. The end result would be more accountable, more statesmanlike, and in time, a more trusted and respected Congress. Mr. Chairman, as I said before, our Congress is on an unsustainable course. We do have the $22 trillion debt, near $1 trillion annual deficits. The trust funds for Social Security and Medicare have been spent on other things. The transportation fund is empty, and we could go on and on. That's why when I ran for Congress, I limited my own term, consistent with your amendment of 6 years in the House and 2 in the Senate, hoping to get the freedom to rock the boat, to challenge the system, to try to change this unsustainable course where one that we can actually build a better America. And I'm grateful for you for introducing it. I am very well aware of all the arguments on both sides. But when I came to Congress, I supported term limits in theory. Now I support it after seeing what really happens here. And we know, as I said before, that power corrupts, and it has corrupted absolutely here in Washington, and it's the seniority system that drives it all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I will entertain any questions if you'd like.